For the first decade after the Berlin Wall came down, Poland was held up as a democratic model and an economic model for the post-communist countries of Eastern Europe. We were told regularly and constantly that the Polish people had never enjoyed such freedom before, etc., etc. Well, the real story turned out to be a bit different in Poland as in other parts of the former Eastern Europe. Each of these countries has its own trajectory, linked to its own past. None of them are exactly the same, but there are certain things which have left behind now a trail of misery for large numbers of working people. And this has been combined with a decline in the fiercely independent intellectual and cultural life of the country, which remained independent even during the communist period. Dissent never died, and some of the most famous radical intellectuals in the 60s and 70s, dissident intellectuals, were produced in Poland. With me is Gonzalo Pozo, a researcher, a specialist on Russian and Eastern European history who lives in Warsaw and is working on a biography of the late great Polish historian Isaac Deutscher, who fled to exile in Britain after the German occupation of Poland and lived in this country for the rest of his life, and is best known for his trilogy on the life of Trotsky. Gonzalo, welcome. Let us start with the Polish model. What happened?
Well, as your intro touched on, Poland has made a poster boy. It's been made a poster boy not just for the first few years after the fall of communism, but way after that. I remember in July 2014, Economist Journal released a special report on Poland. It was called something like Europe's Unlikely Star or Europe's Unlikely Champion. And it was a perfect example of the main narrative that is predominant these days on Poland. It says, we know that Europe is economically in the docks, politically Europe is unappealing, so few people have voted in the last parliamentary elections and so on, but here we have Poland, and Poland has achieved growth levels which are, on average, higher than most other European cases since the fall of communism. Politically, it has been a successful transition to democracy, and it's one of the biggest recipients of EU help, which it has used wonderfully. And why has it done so well in Europe? Because it has pushed harder than the other Eastern European countries in Europe, and so on and so forth. This is the usual bundle of falsifications. It comes hand in hand with neoliberal policy, where you have a registry of successful macroeconomic numbers that don't tell you the story. So the Polish model has struck an economic success in the sense that it hasn't suffered the European crisis as deeply as other European countries. However, the effects on the economic transition and the transformation of Poland into a capitalist economy have been very, very deeply felt by ordinary Poles, and the cost of the transformation has fallen on ordinary Poles. So the story of ordinary Poles is not really told in the media coverage. That sort of comes through when you see the reports on the last rounds of elections, presidential and parliamentary, where two right-wing parties essentially have contested the electoral ballot, and the one which could boast the best economic record has been ousted out of office. So these presentations of Poland as completely successful slightly fly in the face of the last electoral results. How is it possible that this party was ousted?
This is the Civic Freedom Party.
This is the Civic Platform.
The Civic Platform, which is effectively a combination of all the groups who support neoliberalism, who are prepared to do whatever the EU wanted, but which at the same time had become prone to, like parties all over Europe, to corruption, to ennui, incapable of doing anything new, and just resting on its sort of so-called laurels of, look, we transformed Poland into a capitalist state. So they've now been voted out, and they've been replaced by PiS, the other party, which lost power about several years ago when one of the twins who led it died in a plane crash. And Gonzalo, strange things are happening. The other twin, Kaczynski, is now president of Poland. The guy who was a top conspiracy theorist after the crash, saying this wasn't a crash, the Russians shot it down or the Russians did something bad, which was not taken up by anyone serious, either in Poland or outside. This guy, this conspiracy theorist, is now the defense minister of Poland. And a lot of changes are being made. Kaczynski is putting in sort of kooks into the intelligence services, etc. So what is happening to this wonderful model of a successful Poland?
It's relevant that the Law and Justice Party, PiS, has won this election. It won a presidential election last May on a second round against the incumbent president, which was an independent, it was really a Civic Platform candidate. And it won by a very narrow margin. It won that presidential ballot by 3% of the vote, which is just a little over 500,000 votes. It was a very close election. But this rise of Law and Justice Party has been confirmed then in the parliamentary elections. Now, the president of Poland is Andrzej Duda. The leader of the party is Jarosław Kaczyński, who you've mentioned. The Law and Justice Party had been in power in the mid-2000s, and Lech Kaczyński had been president of Poland until an air crash in April 2010, I believe, as he was on his way to commemorate the Katyn massacre, where so many, I think over 22,000 Polish officials, members of the intelligentsia were shot in the back of the head by the NKVD. And as his plane was arriving at the Smolensk airstrip, it crashed, and with Lech, the president, died many of the top brass of the Polish state then. And of course, Katyn already is extremely loaded in Polish politics because it symbolizes, perhaps better than anything else, the very tense relations with Russia. And this, of course, played itself out for people like Jarosław Kaczyński to make a big issue out of a conspiracy theory, suggesting absolutely that the Russians were somehow behind, that this was a kind of Katyn 2.0, something like that. But in the intervening years, the Civic Platform had already come to government, so had already won elections in Poland, and the person who is now president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, was prime minister.
Who, I'm told, the current government wants to prosecute for something or the other.
There's been a lot of noise recently, yes. Relations on that issue, relations between Jarosław Kaczyński, the surviving twin of the Kaczynskis, and Tusk have been very bitter. So there's been, for many years, a lot of rivalry between them. Tusk has generally won elections over Kaczynski. And yes, there's been quite a lot of talk that the Law and Justice Party will not be supporting a second term by Tusk in his current European position. Now, in terms of how this fits slightly more broadly within the European constellation, again, I think the point to stress is that Polish politics has been playing out in a very dominantly right-wing field. These are two right-wing parties. The only difference between them is that the Law and Justice Party is a bit more Eurosceptic, and in terms of social issues, is much more conservative than the liberal Civic Platform. The Civic Platform is a member of the European Popular Party, along with, the European Party of Chancellor Merkel and so on. The Law and Justice Party is a member of the European Party that also the Conservatives are in. And they won this election, and I'm talking now about the parliamentary election, in a way that is very significant. They won it very substantively. They won a very clear, by a very clear margin.
All over, in town and countryside?
In town and countryside, their traditional constituency
was the countryside.
It was the countryside, the more eastern part of the country. That's still the case, and voters of an older generation, again, who have felt sidetracked by this economic miracle that Poland is supposed to have been, and
they promised to reduce the pension age, or no?
They promised to regain some ground on the extension of the pension age, which had been one of the reforms that the Civic Platform had pushed, particularly in 2013.
So the pension age is 70 at the moment? Or?
The pension age is 67, and so the talk is to take it back to 65. But this is something that Polish trade unions have been very active about, and so have been very militant about. In fact, if you look at the main coverage of the elections, you have a very surprising line, which is, okay, if this is such a wonderful place, how come the Civic Platform has lost the election so widely? And you can't really say anything bad about the Civic Platform, given that it's the darling of European politics in Poland. So the explanations then become a little bit nutty. For instance, one very prominent explanation is that the Poles are definitely much better off than they were a few years ago, but that they want more. So they want to be more like the Germans. They want their living standards to increase by even more. It's a fairly thin explanation, I would say. I think there's 2 or 3 main issues. I think the Law and Justice Party played social issues very, very well. That drew a defining line between the two groups. And
this is gay marriage, abortion, etc.
Yeah, for reproduction rights and so on. This is one of the most conservative countries in Europe. The grip of the Polish of the Catholic Church in Poland. Strong. It's almost absolute. It's hegemonic.
Yeah,
and it's not at all rare to find public buildings, for instance, with crosses on the wall. I mean, I don't mean you wouldn't necessarily find this sort of thing in Warsaw as such, but if you move out of the big cities, you can see things
they have
like
crosses on state buildings.
You can find public buildings, public institutions with crosses. Now imagine any other kind of religious symbol on the wall.
So the crosses replace the hammer and sickle.
Yes, absolutely. But I think also in the hearts of many Polish opponents. Nevertheless, I think there's 2 other issues that I wanted to touch on, because I think they're quite important. More or less around the time that The Economist was publishing this report in Poland that I've mentioned, we had the tape scandal, you might remember. This was an investigative journal called Wprost, who released recordings of several governing ministers having conversations in restaurants. I think they're extremely telling of not just the nonsense that European politics at large supports, but also of the incumbents, of the people who are involved in these recordings.
These were government ministers?
Yes, absolutely.
And they were discussing what?
So, for instance, one of the most spectacular recordings involve the then foreign minister Radosław Sikorski. He was recorded saying that the Polish-American alliance was, his words, bullshit. That it was good for nothing, that it only created a sense of false security in Poles, that if Poles went into some conflict with the Russians or with the Germans, they'd feel protected by the Americans, all, again his words, because Poland has given the US a blowjob. These are the very elegant terms used by the first diplomat of the country at that time, which Donald Tusk wanted to promote as Europe's leading diplomat. The other tape was also spectacular. It involved the president of the Polish National Bank at that time, a man called Marek Belka, discussing with the interior minister a number of issues. And at one point, the interior minister says, look, why don't you do something with the economy? Because we'll have elections next year and we need a better record. 2013 was one of those years where Polish growth was thinning out. And what does the head of the National Polish Bank say? He doesn't say, oh, well, constitutionally I'm independent. No, he doesn't say, what are you trying to do, meddle in? No, he says, well, okay, but I have my conditions. You have to sack the finance minister. The finance minister had been sacked in November 2013. The recordings were from before. So presumably Belka's conditions and terms were met.
Consider who taped this stuff?
Well, this has been a major bone of contention. Wprost doesn't divulge its sources, only says that it was a businessman who taped them. The government at that time, and especially Donald Tusk, suggested that this had been some kind of attempt at a secret coup by members of the mafia and so on. And in fact, Wprost's offices were raided by the special forces, and one of Poland's biggest businessmen was searched and I believe detained for a little bit. There was a very nervous reaction by the Polish state. But I mean, all this affair not only spoke to the enduring corruption of the Polish model, but also to the enduring flaccidity of some neoliberal dogmas. For instance, the independence of the National Bank, the lack of any collusion between the economy and the politicians and the bureaucrats, the wonders of Poland as a US ally in Europe, and so on and so forth. I think that played some part.
Discrediting them.
In discrediting the civic platform. The other thing that played a part, and this has barely been picked up by the media, is, I think, quite fundamental. In 2013, the relatively healthy economic figures in Poland were suddenly not so healthy. So growth was lower, almost stagnant for a little bit of the year, and the civic platform got very nervous and tried to introduce a number of economic reforms, in particular reforms of the labor code, promoting junk contracts, promoting the extension of the retirement age, promoting cuts on welfare, and health and education are two pillars of the Polish state that Poles are largely unhappy about. And that met with very fierce resistance on the streets, which is a positive note to strike in an otherwise rather dire political
These were
atmosphere.
street demonstrations or trade union strikes?
Mostly trade union-led demonstrations. So here we saw mobilizations up to 100,000 peoples, miners, in particular workers. This was again played out at the beginning of 2014, before the run-up to the presidential and parliamentary elections, when the then Prime Minister Ewa Kopacz tried to take on some very important mines in the region of Silesia, which happens to be the place of the country with the largest unionization rates. So on average, the Polish trade union federations will tell you that something like 15% of the workforce nationally is unionized. It's very, very low. In reality, it's probably much lower than that. But in this region, which is a very, traditionally a mining region, trade union rates are much higher, are way above the national average, maybe 60%, maybe even more than that. And so they went on the streets, they organized a number of demonstrations which were very powerful, and they struck a number of victories. At least they managed to contain the worst effects of the reforms. These two things damaged very much the reputation of the civic platform. But the big question for unions in Poland is, okay, you can mobilize, you can even win sometimes, or win some concessions, but what politically will this all lead to? Where is this all going?
It had no political expression.
It had no political expression. And this is the third incredibly important thing about the last Polish elections. The traditional left-wing party, so-called post-communist party, Social Democratic Party, didn't even make it into parliament in the last elections.
Not a single seat.
Not a single seat. Because, it got, I think, 5.1% of the vote, but because it was in such a weak position, it had made a coalition party with Greens and feminist groups and other active parts of Polish society. And then the threshold for coalition parties becomes higher. They didn't make the 8% threshold. And so this is in a sense a complete disaster. So you have two right-wing parties which differ very little between them. Traditionally, as a social democratic party, which you've spoken about the extreme center, this is the best or the most extreme example of the extreme center I can think of in Poland. They've done exactly the same as the others. There's so little differentiating the record of the Social Democrats in Poland.
Okay, Gonzalo, the picture is bleak. What is the state of Polish culture? Because this is a country with a very rich cultural tradition, which predates communism. It goes right back.
Well, one of the big tragedies of transition is this amazing act of disremembering incredibly valuable traditions of culture, of dissent, of critique in Polish history. I don't think that Poland is a barren place culturally. It would be very silly to say so. Polish has too much. It's too rich culturally still. But the best parts of Polish culture are, in the main, very depoliticized or very easily captured by national narratives that speak to, Catholicism, anti-communism, and all that really became the political mainstream after 1989. And in that sense, Poland has lost a lot of its cultural edge. There are some very interesting, very promising revivals. So for instance, a number of years ago, a group of young Polish researchers, intellectuals, tried to make a break into the Polish cultural scene. They founded a group and a journal, in fact, two journals, called Krytyka Polityczna, the political critique. They've been trying to put into the mainstream a lot of critical theory. Their message is very distinctive and in many senses left-wing, and it's very refreshing. The only problem is that this is, I think self-avowedly, a very intellectual movement only. You have points of comparisons here which could be interesting. In Spain, you had a very politicized small group of intellectuals in the universities who suddenly found themselves with the Indignados, and to their great credit harnessed the energies of the Indignados, and they went on to form Podemos and could try and put a fight electorally. And we'll see how that ends. In Poland, groups like Krytyka Polityczna, who are doing fantastic work, are nevertheless very divorced from social movements, and in particular, workers' demands, trade unions, and so on. And there's still too much of a gulf between the two. And this is a shame. I think they see themselves as very slowly trying to form some kind of cultural space and intellectual space where all these energies might eventually come to.
Gonzalo, what about the Polish cinema? Because, you know, in parts of Eastern Europe, especially Romania, we do see some quite interesting critical films coming up again, or coming up for the first time. But in Poland, we get no reports at all of what is being produced. You don't see their films at film festivals or anything.
Well, again, to declare the place barren of any worthwhile cinematic production would be crazy. You have still active Polish directors that were emblematic of a certain moment, of those traditions that you've alluded to. You have, for instance, Andrzej Wajda. He recently made a film on the Katyn massacre again. Now, this film, I think a number of things can be said about it, but I think it is easily appropriable into this sort of story of the Poles as martyrs of the Russians and victims, but also, of course, heroic victims, and that so easily plugs back into national Catholic values, which present Polish politics is supposed to stand in for.
Gonzalo, to end, let me just ask you one question. What are the chances of something emerging in Poland that is radical, progressive, has some understanding of history, not exclusively from a nationalist viewpoint?
Well, if you speak to Polish activists, their general sense is extremely bleak. So perhaps we should try and find another source of hope for Poland. I think there is still a memory of a trade union mass movement, which was the Solidarity of the 80s, a movement that was, of course, very Catholic, because the Polish working class is Catholic, but where workers took the lead over intellectuals. They spoke the truth to then the communist government. They did not do it in any theoretically convoluted ways. They made very natural class demands and was extremely successful into the autumn of '81. Now, the communist authorities reacted to that by imposing a martial law of several years, which broke the back of the movement, created a discontinuity between Solidarity in 1980 and what then became the party that negotiated the end of communism, and generally demoralized all the left that come from the 50s and from the 60s and that had been so active. But there is still a Polish working class that is active. I think if perhaps the Polish intellectuals can recuperate their traditions in socialism and communism and give those traditions a different language, and understand that the situation is a long-term game for the left, I think that's their best hope. I don't want to, of course, rule out any surprise events, because, of course, history has a tendency to make you look like a fool when you do that. But otherwise, the situation right now for any left-wing alternative in Poland is almost non-existent.
Gonzalo, on that bleak note, we end, but we will carry on, I hope, discussing this and related matters in the months ahead. Thank you.